Thank you very much for coming. I'm going to read the last chapter of this book, giving away the ending. It's called Non-Site, which is S-I-T-E, by the way. One night I'm in Rhinebeck, New York with my wife. After checking into our motel, we go out and buy a pint of wild turkey so we can have a nightcap. Some weeks later, I'm in Brussels. I can't sleep because of jet lag. I pace around the tiny borrowed apartment. I root around in my luggage and find the bottle of wild turkey. Why did I pack it? It's nearly empty. One swallow and it's gone. I go into the kitchen and toss the bottle down the garbage chute. Later, it will be retrieved and recycled by the porter. Eventually, it'll end up in, who knows, reinforced concrete, maybe. The bottle has emigrated and found itself a new purpose in another country. It will add something, however minute, to the economic profile of that country. The porter, upon retrieving it from the weekend's accumulation of junk in the cellar, might take a second to look at the label, might notice its foreign pedigree, then he'll toss it into the bottle bin, where it will break. After that, it will be mere particles within ever larger mounds of broken glass. Its story will be lost. The bottle factory wherever, the distillery in Kentucky, the truck, the warehouse, the weeks or months on the shelf in Rhinebeck, the interval on the shelf in Brooklyn, the gradual diminution of its liquid contents, the trip across the ocean in the hold of a 747, the slide down a 4-story chute in another country. Nobody cares. The next morning, early, I cross Brussels, heading for the southern end of Les Marolles, the old Quartier Populaire, to attend the flea market at Place du Jeu de Balle. When I enter the square, the very first thing I see is a booth selling stationery supplies. I don't understand. This is not the sort of flea market that's where people sell tube socks and keychains and off-brand aftershave. I examine the goods. Nibs, pen holders, hard erasers, ink bottles, blotter pads, wooden pencil boxes with sliding lids, thin ruled notebooks with pictures of cowboys on their covers. Nothing remarkable, not even especially fine merchandise. Just ordinary Belgian school supplies, the kind I use myself. And yet people are picking up these items and gazing at them rapturously. I'm baffled. Then a beefy guy with a mustache holds up one of the notebooks and, addressing a child or the stall holder or nobody in particular, exclaims, "When I was a kid, I had notebooks just like this." There's a catch in his throat. "We all did, pal," the proprietor growls. It's only then that I get it. I've lost many things over the years, some of them important. I've left stuff behind in moves. There's stuff I had to give away because there wasn't room for it. I've thrown things out that I later regretted. I've given items drenched in sentiment and history to girlfriends in the early rush of entanglements that wound up lasting all of a month. At some point, I inherited my maternal grandfather's watch chain, an extraordinary thing from the Congo, made to look like a helix of entwined lianas. And first, the tiny ivory elephant fell off somewhere in Rockefeller Center when I was working as a messenger. And a few months later, the chain itself was stolen during a break-in in my slum apartment. Other things were stolen in burglaries or else by friends during that strange period in the early 1980s when absolutely nobody could be trusted. I sold stuff when I was trying to live by my wits and finding out their exact limitations. I lent things to people and they got lost, or I forgot to ask for them back, or forgot to pick them up, or forgot whom I'd lent them to, or lost track of the party in question. I gave away items from my childhood because I was disgusted by the thought of my childhood, or because I was on one of my crusades to lighten my material burden, or because I wanted to make a grand gesture. There are objects my parents gave or threw away without consulting me because they were angry at me, or simply because it never occurred to them. Then there's stuff that just disappeared. Things I always thought I had tucked away safely until the day I went to look for them. I don't remember what year it is. I remember to return the phone call months after the fact. By the time I get around to checking the listings for the movie, it isn't showing anywhere anymore. I want to go have lunch at that place on Route 46, I tell my wife as we're driving, but there's no trace of it, and I realize I last saw it 30 years ago. I see a photograph by Bernice Abbott of a country store in the Bronx, of all places, and I nearly have my coat on and subway fare in hand before it occurs to me that the picture was taken in the 1940s, and the place isn't likely to have survived. I see another picture, a very sharply detailed shot of the marketplace in Potsdam on a sunny day in the 1880s, and for a split second I'm convinced that I was there. I suddenly remember a package I left at the foot of the stairs in 1979, and I want to retrieve it. And it takes me a minute or two before I understand that 1979 is not accessible by foot, subway, bus, car, plane, or boat. I hear a light guitar chord, and then another, and then a third, heavier one that reverberates. And then a tenor carefully enunciates, "My love must be a kind of blind love. I can't see anyone but you," while guitar and bass and a piano player plinking one key somehow contrive to give the impression of an organ, a Hammond lounge organ with Leslie cabinet, a machine emitting the auditory equivalent of silk. And then here come the patterns shot through the cloth, the other flamingos crowding together to chirp, "Dubop chubop," and then the floor falls away, and I'm in Midtown Manhattan in 1960 at the close of a hot autumn day, the red sun just sitting on the New Jersey horizon at the end of every cross street, the sound coming from a swarm of transistor radios all around, held by teenage girls in kerchiefs and toreador pants and white shirts knotted at the waist, each with a cigarette in the other hand held up and flipped back. I comb through flea markets obsessively, not looking for anything really, just looking. In Brussels, I see red trays covered with shellacked cigar bands, mass-produced African masks, polished hammered brass pitchers and jugs, albums of neatly mounted Chocolat Jacques cards of the royal family at work and play. Objects I used to see all the time in people's houses, but had forgotten. I see wedding portraits that are the spit and image of my parents. Same lighting, pose, expressions, clothing, hairstyles. I see boxes filled with baptismal announcements and communion announcements and souvenirs pieux, identical to the ones stuffed between the pages of my grandparents' leather-bound missals. In Charleroi, along the quay, I see gilt oval frames hanging from the trees, containing glaucous portraits of taxidermized pre-war citizens, exactly like the ones I enjoyed being scared by when I'd root through my grandparents' things in the attic of our Pasteur house when we went back in 1962 and 63. I see beer and soft drink advertisements featuring winking monks and beehive girls that I might have sat under in the Café Terminus in Theux, as my mother and I waited for the bus after visiting my grandfather in the morbid 17th century hospice during the bleak spring of 1963. I see our old radio, our dishes, our framed prints, our books, our tablecloths, our deck chairs, our slotted spoons, our calendars, even our parlor stove with its trademark of a running bipedal creature made of flames. In Liège, along Boulevard de la Constitution, I see piles of picture-sleeve 45s by Les Cousins, Les Chats Sauvages, Dick Rivers, Dalida, France Gall, Adamo, and of course Johnny Hallyday, né de Smet, that Paul and Audrey and I sang along with and practiced the twist to. I see water-damaged panoramic photographs of the grotto at Lourdes, racks of chipped meerschaum pipes, cracked souvenir ashtrays from the '58 World's Fair, bundled stacks of moldy pamphlets of Walloon plays, rusted tin pails and shovels with patches of bright color still visible, boxes of dog-eared pot boilers with crudely sensational cover drawings and pseudo-American pseudonyms, rush cane chairs whose caning has been reduced to splinters, solo leather-topped crutches, broken vases, broken appliances, broken toys, and hundreds of photographs of grandparents and fiancés and scout troops and 1918 war veterans and children staring out from under the giant beard of Saint Nicolas. These things make me feel patriotic. I'm saddened when I consider obsolete computer equipment, defunct videotaping systems, superannuated synthesizer keyboards, useless and outmoded duplication hardware, forgotten once revolutionary medical gizmos, movie cameras and Polaroid cameras designed for film that's no longer manufactured. When I had a job in the university library during college, I would now and then borrow a key from the front desk and go down to the second level of the stacks, where I would visit the closed annex whose shelves were populated by thousands of outdated or discredited scientific texts and serried ranks of 19th century German doctoral dissertations printed in Fraktur. I felt tenderly toward them. I want to rescue from the trash stranger snapshots, discarded mail, orphan diaries, widowed keepsake volumes, inconsequential random scrapbooks of undated clippings, contextless bureau drawer contents dumped into cardboard boxes, unloved detritus of every description. I feel a stab when I come upon an old book that's falling to pieces, and the inner layer of the spine is revealed as consisting of some even older recycled text, lines sweated out by somebody somewhere. I get a chill when I think of Miss Butterbean Harvest of 1938, or the up-and-coming young Rotarian feed vendor of DeKalb County in the year before the crash, or the bard of Upper Canada whose verses were memorized by school children in the 1890s, or the leading exponent of the single tax west of the Mississippi, or the fastest change maker in the Rio de Janeiro rapid transit system under the old currency, or the finest painter of devotional scenes in Moravia during the Empire, none of whose accomplishments are now preserved or remembered by anybody. The past is a quiet place where change occurs in increments of glacial slowness. It is a perpetually verdant landscape. You can go there and find that nothing much has happened since your last visit. Your relatives and acquaintances are fixed in stereotypical postures and occupations. Your grandmother is still mending that same old coat. It's fairly boring to visit, but sometimes you need an interval of that boredom amid the frenetic pace of your normal activities. There you can resume the life you knew from before, that you've always known. You can drop your defenses and affectations and ease into the old ways as if they were a pair of carpet slippers that long ago took on the exact shape of your feet. You can hear the old stories all over again, exchange the same observations on the weather with the same people as on all your previous visits, eat the same meals, experience the same reassuring emotions as always. And when you return to your home in the present, you find that the calendar page and the hands of the clock stand where they were when you left. The minute you notice this, you simultaneously forget all the details of your trip so that they can remain evergreen until your next visit. It's good to know that the past is there, always ready to welcome you, just an ocean away. But I'm never sure what anybody means when they speak of the future. When I was growing up, I assumed without thinking much about it that my early adulthood would be spent in the appropriately forward-looking, breezily confident 1950s, and that in my middle years I would graduate to a firm footing in that mature but dynamic era that you can see in movies made between 1936 and America's entry into the war, and that old age would find me at leisure in a long white beard and a cottage decked in rose trellises and wisteria vines in the peaceful security of the 1890s. I might have doubted whether I or anybody else would ever get to the future, an ideal of such seductive promise, but such stern requirements, a peak lost in the clouds. It only looks more distant from my adult window, if I can even see it at all. The future is an abandoned city, a locomotive ensnared in jungle growth, a ruined phalanstery on a high desert plateau, A manifesto written in pictograms no one living can decipher. An uprising suppressed so quickly that no pictures were taken. A live oak with an unknown word carved into it. A colony of idealists who turned to the manufacture of kitchen appliances. A design for rational living that forgot to account for toilets. An archive of unpublished masterpieces curated by the secret police. A cafe whose once famous corner table was removed and replaced with a video poker machine. A few years' worth of entries in the early journals of someone who died broke, died insane, died a highly respected figure in the carpet trade. I live in moderate comfort in the present, on a permanent resident visa, while I hold a passport issued by the authority of the past. This situation presents some minor difficulties. Nothing grave, mind you, just a few privileges denied me. Now and then I wonder why I maintain this state of affairs. What advantage can it possibly represent? And I have to admit that there is no particular advantage. Maybe an exit door, although by now it might open onto a wall or a pit or an enclosed vacant lot with scattered rat droppings, if it isn't in fact rusted shut. Maybe it's a matter of nostalgia, like awaiting the return of the Savior, the return of the gold standard, the return of the Broadway musical, the return of Zorro. Maybe I can't bring myself to pledge allegiance to the present because I continue, obscurely, to believe in the chimera of the future. When it shows up, I'll go directly to its governing agency and have my papers transferred. Or maybe my reluctance is simply due to the fact that such a pledge seems redundant. The present is everywhere, holds dominion over all, controls all discourse and all economy, has just about squelched the last pockets of resistance to its tide. Do we need to assemble every morning and confirm our agreement to the day's weather? Would the weather change if we demurred? The past is a notional construct, a hypothesis, a poem. I hold on to its passport because it was issued in my birth, without any possibility of my assenting or not. It's not so much a document as it is a brand or a scar. I don't really endorse the past, mind you, and I don't intend to go back and settle there. My actual relation to the past is ironic, if anything, even if the irony is poisoned with sentiment. I can laugh at the past, but the laughter sticks in my throat. I certainly feel more affection for it from a distance. And only from within the past can I appreciate the present, which is all things considered a dispiriting place to live. Each of them is a shabby, passive-aggressive dictatorship of compromise and self-delusion. Under the rhetoric, we all know this. I'm not alone because every single one of us is an alien, and that makes us all compatriots. Thank you. Anybody got any questions? Yes.
I'm very curious. At the end of the Factory of Facts, in your thanks section, you mention your parents, and you say that, obviously without them it wouldn't have been an issue to begin with, and you hope that while they may not necessarily agree with the way you presented it, they hope that they value. I'm curious, have they read it, and what is their response to the way you've presented your family history?
My father loved it. My mother hasn't read the whole thing, but she's quibbling about details. This thing happened this happened in 1936, not 1937, etc. Yeah. So no, it's been all right actually. I was afraid of treading on toes, but when I'll really be hit with the barrage is when the French edition comes out in about 2 years. Anybody else? Yes.
I have a question about not this book.
Mm-hmm.
I read your introduction to Jacob Riis's book.
Uh-huh.
How did you get chosen to do that? Just out of curiosity.
Well, because I wrote a book about, for a couple of reasons. I've written about New York City history and I've written about photography. And I wrote about Jacob Riis in this book I wrote called Low Life, which is about, history of the slums. So that's basically how it happened. No, I didn't know him personally or anything. Yeah. Yes.
I'm wondering how it feels, you being a book critic, and I just recently read a review, I've read a couple of reviews of your book, but how it feels to be on the flip side of things, like being reviewed rather than being the reviewer. And how you
Well,
feel.
yeah, it's made me take a solemn vow to be really nice to people from here on in. Yeah, yeah, I mean, you really realize how, as a critic, you have tremendous power, if not over readers, you certainly have it over authors, because, you know, somebody can spend X number of years slaving away on their history of the Hungarian economic system, and the one reviewer in the TLS dismisses it with a flick, and suddenly your whole structure crumbles. But at the same time, you know, I think it's interesting. You know, the job of the critic is so complicated anyway, because you really have to. You're a writer, and the one thing you cannot do as a critic, and a lot of critics do, is compete with the author. A lot of critics do this. They think, wow, great subject. They just write a piece about it, make a fast allusion to the book, and that's that. But you're really serving as a kind of bridge between the author and the reader, you know, because you try to imagine, you know, I don't know, this is going to be contrary to current literary theory and what have you, but I think that as far as book reviews go, you really do have to take intention keep it in mind somehow. Figure out what the author meant to do and how closely the author came to realizing his or her ambition or plan. And at the same time, you have to explain all this to the reader who doesn't know anything, presumably. You know, you assume that the reader is intelligent but doesn't know anything about the subject if it's nonfiction. And, you know, and it is a strange feeling, you know, every few years putting out a book and suddenly being on the other end of the table. Yes.
I'm curious about how you went about researching this book, and as opposed to like Low Life, which is something about New York City. I mean, you probably, seems like you use the archive, you really get into this kind of tunnel of information. How did you do that with yourself?
Well, it's kind of, you know, it's not that different, really. I mean, I'm kind of addicted to research, and it's sort of a bad addiction, and one which I can't keep doing it, because it's research becomes its own reward or something like that. But well, what made it different in this case, gentleman alluded to my thanks to my parents, and in there I sort of credited them with being my co-authors. And what I meant by that is that when I thought of writing this book, which is a complicated process, one of the first things I did was interview my parents, and I sort of used what they told me as a kind of template, and went and filled in the details. And it's, you know, so that I can't imagine having approached this project without input from my parents, but it did send me in a lot of different avenues of research. And actually for this book, I got so fascinated with my own subject that I wound up not using something like 95% of what I could have used, because I figured nobody would really be interested in the history of my native city, and so few people, especially in America, have ever heard of the Walloon language. It probably wouldn't be a good idea to write a history of the Walloon language. But I found you know, tremendous amounts of this material. It's amazing how much stuff there is on these really abstruse Belgian questions in New York City, probably because American soldiers in World War I rescued these things from the ruins and brought them back, and they haven't been consulted in 80 years, and they're falling to pieces. You know, but it was like finding little traces of my past in the stacks of the NYPL is a weird thing. Yes.
You know, apropos of what you just said about how much somebody's actually going to be interested in when it's personally relative to you, my first encounter with your writing was through the New York Review of Books, and it was the excerpts in there that were from what became the Factory of Facts that got me interested in reading the book. And as I read the book, I kept thinking, what the hell do I care? I mean, it's like, I thought he's not world famous. He's not, somebody I've admired my whole life. He's a writer who I've recently become interested in. And I realized what kept my attention the whole time was the fact that you tell a wonderful story. And I was wondering if, in your research back through your family, is there any reputation through your ancestors of people who were consistently great storytellers? I mean, is that something that runs through your family?
It's funny. Well, thank you for the compliment. I don't really know. My father is sort of a raconteur, but I don't know that much about my family. I mean, that's another reason why I was impelled to write this book, because, growing up, I grew up as an immigrant, along with my parents here, with no brothers or sisters and no other relatives in the United States. And my grandparents all died by the time I was 10. And one of my grandfathers had a reputation for being a raconteur and as well as a kind of singer at weddings and stuff like that, and he died before I was born. And as far as anybody else is concerned, I haven't the slightest idea. For one thing, everybody in my family more than 100 years ago was illiterate, every one of them. So there's no records, there's no diaries, there's no letters, there's nothing. As far as like why one should care about this story, I bore that in mind very much. That's why, one of the reasons why I kind of don't really think of this as a memoir, even though that's what it says above the barcode on the back. I was thinking about the fact that everybody is a product of history. Everybody is made by these events. In my case, I'm just taking myself as an example, and that's what this book is, among other things. But I assume that everybody on Earth could write a similar book. I'm here today in part because of the crisis of heavy industry in Western Europe in the 1950s, and I'm also because of World War II, also because of the migration from the countryside into the cities that took place early this century, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's just this whole pile of historical accidents, and those things affect everybody. And increasingly in the world, there's this diaspora. When my parents and I came here in the early 60s, there wasn't much immigration going on. We got our green cards in Belgium by mail. I mean, before we ever came here, it wasn't an issue. It was no problem. About 10 years later is when massive migration around the world started happening, and there's more and more people who are, out of touch with their roots or whatever. I mean, who are growing up